determines how serious a person may think their problem is. The possibility for recovery exists. It may increase the difficulty, but I've seen some people who were in situations that were very desperate, that came back, so to speak, and recovered from a devastating problem that, I'm sure I would have never wanted to deal with, but they dealt with it with a great deal of grace, and succeeded at becoming very productive individuals in their life that contributed a lot to their world once they got into recovery. What amazed me the most was how desperate some people's situations were, yet they could still recover. Well, when I first started drug and alcohol work, I filled in a lot of churches in the Presbytery for pastors on vacation or study leave or whatever. And of course I always mentioned what I did full time, which always led to interesting discussions as I was shaking hands with people after church. People would ask for advice about a friend or a relative that had an alcohol or drug problem. And sometimes people would introduce themselves as being in recovery for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And the recovering people, I would ask them, do the people in this congregation understand where you came from? And generally the answer was no, that nobody knew they were in recovery or what their past was. Because they really weren't sure how people in the church would respond to that. And they really wanted people to know them as they were now, not as they used to be. And so that sparked my interest in, I used to try to encourage my clients to get involved in whatever faith tradition they may have come out of. And a lot of times the response was, well, I'll go back to church after I have my act together. And I said, well, I would hope the church was a place where you could get your act together. And a lot of people have found it that way, but that's not always true with people in recovery. They feel that the church is only looking for people who've already achieved perfection. They don't want people who are struggling with problems.
Definitely the Joseph and the coat of many colors. You'll recall that Joseph was having some dreams where he was ruling over his brothers, and his brothers didn't take too kindly to that. And when Joseph went out to check on his brothers, they ended up kidnapping him and selling him into slavery. And later on, after some trials and tribulations there, Joseph became a pretty powerful person in Egypt. And later on, when his father passed away, Joseph went back to be with his brothers and to take care of that situation. And when his brothers came, knew that he was coming back, they were pretty nervous about what they had done to him, and he was sort of a powerful man now. But the response that Joseph had to them about not being afraid, because what you had intended for evil, God was able to use for his good and for his glory. And to me, I think that just is the essence of recovery. I don't think that I would be at this place in my spiritual walk if I hadn't gone through a divorce and then the rehab twice and losing my brother. But I can see how God can take those moments and use them for good and to be able to help other people who have gone through those things.
I think one of the main things to keep in mind is that we all have attachments. We all have some form of addiction, if you will. Our human brains are made to work that way. The attraction that we have to sin and so on. So we're all in the same boat. People with addiction may have more destructive patterns that are socially unacceptable, and my addiction may be more socially acceptable. You know, it could be the shopping network, it could be ice cream, it could be whatever, but we all have our struggles. And so they're not, people in addiction with alcoholism or drugs are not totally different from us. We're all in it together. And so I think that's very important to remember that. And
I think the most important thing that I want to drive home for people is the idea that there is no cure for the disease of addiction. There is no easy fix. But this isn't a war on drugs. You know, this is not a war on the addict, on the person with the substance use disorder. I believe that the opposite of addiction is connection. And that connection is so, so very important. When we as human beings are meant to be connected and loved and social, and continuing to propagate the stigma of the disease of addiction is only further harming us as a community, because we are only as strong as our weakest link. As a community, all of us together, like it or not, we are all connected. So I think that stigmatizing and isolating substance use disorders and families who struggle with those issues is only going to continue to further the prevalence of the disease. So I think it's really important that we band together, because unity is the answer, and love wins the war. Ultimately, love wins that war. You know, because this is human life. You know, the opposite of addiction is connection, and we need that continued connection, and we need that continued unity in order to help people recover. Because with connection, recovery isn't just possible; it's probable. It's probable. We do recover. Right? I'm a living, breathing example of that, and so are many of my friends, so are many of the people that I love the most. You know, recovery is probable when we are connected.
I wish that people knew the impact of their treatment towards others. And I will include myself in that, because, you know, a lot of times we can kind of condone or overlook or underappreciate the impact that we can have on someone's life. And by that I mean that sometimes, yeah, it's just a pick-me-up phrase. Sometimes it's a supportive posture or gesture. Sometimes it's just an attitude that you know, you're accepting of someone else regardless of what they've gone through, regardless of their history or their vices. I kind of explain that to everyone. Just because you're not in active addiction doesn't mean, we don't have those own things that we battle. Drugs, that's their battle. But what's your battle? You have a battle too. I have a battle too. And it might not be drugs, but it's as challenging for us, perhaps, as it is for them. So how can we say, oh, they can't get control of their life. Look at them, they're a mess, and where they deserve to die because, substance use is a choice. That's mind-blowing to me, because I think of all of the people who supported me through tough times. Although it wasn't substance use disorder or addiction, it was maybe a divorce, and I think how impactful their encouraging words were, their attitudes were, and their like unconditional support was during that time. And I think if I didn't have that, if I was like in addiction, I had very few supports or very few people who were like that in my life, would I be in the spot that I'm in, or would I not have made it through that hard time? So for me, it's really, I can kind of relate it to this idea of agape love, right? That's kind of in the Bible. Is it truly unconditional? When Jesus was walking on earth, I think he personified God's love so well, because it wasn't conditional, right? He was sent for the sinners, in his own words. And I think about that as it applies to, all of us, that we all have shortcomings, that we all have those iniquities and transgressions. But when we love someone else, do we have to get something in return in order to love that person? I just remember in the Gospels, Jesus was like, what credit is that to you if you love someone and someone loves you back? The implication is almost like, it's almost like a higher calling to love someone when you're not expecting anything in return, and when you don't get anything in return. So that's kind of like my philosophical point of view when I look at this debate between substance use and drug addiction as a moral dilemma, or a brain disease, or something that should be judged or not judged. I think, who am I? Who are we to really judge what someone else is going through when, Jesus himself. I remember the parable that describes the woman who committed adultery, and they were ready to stone her, right? And he says, okay, if for anyone who hasn't sinned, you can throw the first stone. And one by one, they all walked away, because we all have our shortcomings. We all have those areas in life that we're not proud of. And substance use disorder and addiction may be that for someone, may not be for someone else. But we all need that love, compassion, that unconditional support and encouragement, no matter what we're going through, whether it's drug addiction or something else.